are so glad that you guys are with us as we kick off this new series called Back to the Community and celebrate one of the greatest movies ever made called Back to the Future, which depicted what the future would look like in October 2015. And they're way off because our cars are not flying and our boards are not exactly hovering. And but the Cubs, they did depict, I don't know if you know this, if you guys remember the movie, they depicted the Cubs winning the World Series. And there's a chance. One person cares, all right. And they did depict that we'd have sunglasses like this, and so I guess that happened. And actually what I've done every service is throw in this pair of glasses at the person who thinks they want them the most and will actually wear them. This guy does. I don't know if this is going to get to you, okay, and it might hit you in front of him, okay, so just get ready. Here we go. Yes, decent. And now they're broken. You're welcome. Actually, last night I threw them, and it hit a State fan, and I felt like she deserved it, but... It's funny, I come from a divided house. I have my oldest son loves the Michigan Wolverines, and my middle son loves the Spartans, and my youngest son thinks football is stupid, and we all kind of fall in one of those categories. Anyway, but we're glad that you're with us. My name is Kevin. If I've never met you, I'm one of the pastors around here. And what we're going to talk about, in fact, it's such a great weekend to start it. If you have a student in our student community, we call it Stuco, they spent Friday night and last night having a big retreat right here. We shut the building down. They took over it. And they had this amazing big retreat right here, celebrating their relationship with Jesus and having awesome services. But most importantly, building community for the school year ahead of them. And they hung out the whole time with their small group leaders and built community. It was a really, really awesome weekend that ended with all of them coming to the first service at 8:45 today and sleeping right here in front of me because they hadn't slept much all weekend. But it was such an amazing weekend. It was so cool for them to be focused on community into the school year and for us to start this series talking about the value of community. We believe that the Bible shows us to be evident for every one of us that the best way forward in your life, the best way into the future for you individually and for us as a church is to go back to the things that we were meant to do from the beginning. That we'd go back to the community that we were created for and be reminded of how important community is. Now, one of the interesting things about God is there's this word used to describe him that basically means God is community. It's the word, the Trinity. It's a theological word that's used to kind of get our arms around something that's mysterious and big and beyond us, which is that God is one, but that God also functions in three separate parts. You've heard people pray in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And throughout Scripture, it says that God is one. We're to worship one God and follow the living God, the creator of all. And yet we see God function in these three different ways as God the Father and God the Son and God the Holy Spirit, that you can pray to them all. You can worship them all, that they are one God. And it's kind of mysterious, it's kind of confusing. What's interesting about it is just simply that God in and of himself is community. In fact, if you go back to the creation story, when God's beginning in Genesis 1 to put the world together and doing all these awesome things, it says this in Genesis 1:26. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness." That God refers to himself plural, that in and of himself is community. And then if that's confusing at all, I kind of opening a can of worms here that maybe you grew up a certain way, you've heard certain things and you have questions about that, because I know it can be kind of a confusing topic. And so I found a meme this week that I really think clarifies the Trinity for you, and as memes do. So just let this soak in for just a second. Thinking of the Trinity. Right? Are you there, Dad? It's me, you. Anyway, but seriously, if it's confusing to you anyway, we would love to get you in connection with one of our pastors or with some other ways to study and to understand these two themes that run throughout Scripture. But the point for us today to start is that God in and of himself is community. But then he takes it a step further and he creates you and I for community. And in the creation story, God is busy creating amazing, awesome things. And he makes the sun and it's good. And he makes animals and it's good. It's awesome. It's perfect. And then the first thing not good in the story of creation is written down in Genesis 2, verse 18. And God said it this way: "It is not good for man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." It is not good for human beings to be alone. We are made for community. God is community, and we are made for community. That's why God made men and women. He made friends and family. We're built for community. But if we're made to be in community, then why do we often find community so hard? I mean, why are people so annoying if we're supposed to be in relationship with them? You ever felt like that? I mean, why is being a friend such a tough thing to do? Why is finding great friends so hard? I mean, how many of you would be honest enough to say, you know what, this week, just this last week, small, big, I was annoyed with another human being? Any of you? Yeah, and the rest of you just don't want to be honest right now. I don't know why. How many of you would be honest and say that right now you're annoyed with the person sitting next to you? Like we just get annoyed with each other. We're selfish beings, and when God calls us to be in community, when our worlds collide, our selfishness collides, and we annoy each other. We get on each other's nerves. We hurt one another. Community is remarkably difficult to do well, and yet we were created for it, designed for it, called to it. So what we want to do for the next couple of weeks is look at the different aspects of community, talk about the value, look at different pieces, and what we'll start with today is the concept of friendship. Really, every relationship given to us is a gift from God. Your whole life could boil down to two relationships. The relationship you're invited into with your Creator, and the relationships He's blessed you with other people who were made in His likeness also. Relationships are the two things those are the two things we'll care about on our deathbed someday. Our relationship with God and our relationship with other people. They're the greatest gift God's given us. And then Jesus in His teaching takes relationships and friendship a whole other step further. In one of His teachings, Jesus said this. The Apostle John quoted him. Jesus was teaching. He said, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you." That's a big kind of love that Jesus had for us, for you. He says, "Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. For you are my friends, if you do what I command you." Jesus would go on to talk to His disciples in that moment and say, "I am your friend. I am the Messiah. I am the Creator God. I am a part of God's redemptive story. I'm going to die on a cross and be raised again, and I am calling you friend." He calls you friend. And then He puts a call on your life to be a kind of friend like He's been to you. To be the kind of friend who's marked by and known for their love and their forgiveness, that quite literally, for those of you and I that call ourselves followers of Christ, we should be the best kind of friends that the world sees. And even if you're not a follower of Christ, like you're just coming to church and trying to figure stuff out and figure out God and Bible and all that stuff, every one of us in this room has some next steps to take in regards to the kind of relationships that we have, friends that we have, and the kind of friend that we are. And so what I thought we would do today is look at two stories that highlight the value of friendship and relationships in our life. These are two stories of two great men from the history of God's people, two prominent characters in the Old Testament. And when you lay their lives next to each other, it's amazing the parallels that they share, but what's crazy is how different their lives ended up. The first guy is a guy named Samson. Even if you've never really been to church before, you've probably heard the name Samson or heard parts of the story of a guy with long hair and like Hulk-like strength. Samson was a dude who arrives on the scene in the Old Testament in the history of God's people as a messianic deliverer. He was born, angels visited his mom and dad and said, "You're going to have a son named Samson, and he's going to have incredible strength, and he's going to lead my people and free them from the Philistines." Now, the Philistines were the then oppressor of God's people in Israel. The people of Israel had come to the promised land, and yet these Philistines, who were pagan people who hated most everything about the Israelites, had this incredible gun control where they cut off the Israelites from having any access to the raw materials to create metal and have swords and spears and an army. And so all they had was sticks, and they kept beating them all the time. And so God's people kept being oppressed by the Philistines. So God says, here comes Samson, who's going to lead my people, and he's got this mission to free them from the Philistines. The problem was that Samson, though he had this miraculous strength that was part of a Nazirite vow where he could not cut his hair, as long as he didn't cut his hair, he would maintain his strength. Not too unlike the movie Tangled. Samson had long hair, And he's got this incredible strength. And what it formed in his life were some bad habits of taking off into enemy territory, of depending too much on his own strength, forgetting where it comes from, not doing the things that God called him to do, taking too many risks, getting on the nerves of the Philistines, lighting torches on foxes' tails and burning down the grain fields and the wheat fields of the Philistines, which is like lighting somebody's cash on fire. He was hated by the Philistines, and they were constantly trying to catch him. And he'd become like the public enemy, number one for the Philistines. And then Samson, about the age of 40, his life fell apart. He had a moral failure. He kept hanging out with a friend with benefits who happened to also be a Philistine named Delilah, who was a part of the enemy's camp. And even though he knew that, even though she actually tried to betray him 3 other times, he just kept voluntarily, blindly walking into ambushes thinking he's invincible. And one time in weakness, he tells her the secret to his strength. When he falls asleep, she cuts his hair. She sells him out, and the Philistines overpower him, gouge his eyes out, and capture this pesky Samson, zapped of his strength, and then blind, in chains, with a bad haircut. Samson spent the rest of his life as a slave until the Philistines had a big party, like a crazy Mardi Gras kind of party in this pagan temple. Thousands of them were there. And they thought, hey, let's bring out Samson, our conquered foe, and have a little fun with him. And as the weak, blind Samson in chains was escorted in, he saw an opportunity to redeem his failure. And he asked the young boy who was guiding him to put him in the middle of the temple and chain him to the center pillars. And there, Samson prayed this prayer. It's recorded in Judges 16. And Samson prayed to the Lord, "Sovereign Lord, remember me, please God. Strengthen me just once more and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Then Samson reached towards the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood. Bracing himself against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other, Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And then he pushed with all of his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and on all of the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than while he lived. That flash of glory is what we remember Samson by. An epic thing that happened, but ultimately was a failure because he didn't free them from the Philistines. They still were in control. It's amazing and it's miraculous, but it wasn't the goal. It wasn't the mission. It's not why he was born. It wasn't what he was meant to do. He failed. Now, compare that story with the life of the next guy. Born about the time Samson died in his spectacular temple suicide, was a young man named David, the youngest son of Jesse, a guy who actually grew up somewhat isolated out in the fields, caring for sheep, learning to protect them, but there cultivating a relationship and a love for God and his humility and his love and his passion. He wrote poetry and he wrote worship songs about how much he loved God and how in awe he was of who the Creator was. And in his humility, God picked him and anointed him to be the future king of Israel. Now, at the time, there was a different king, the first king of Israel named King Saul. And Saul was not very good at being a godly king. He tried, but he failed. And so God picks David to replace him. And David, if you've ever heard, even if you've never been in church, you've heard of David and Goliath. That's this guy. Because he goes out and he doesn't kill lots of Philistines. He only kills one, but he kills the right one. And there his life totally changed. And he would later become the king of Israel. He would do what King Saul and what Samson never did, and he would free the Israel people from the Philistines. More importantly, he would establish Israel as a nation, give it a capital city of Jerusalem. He would protect its borders. He would bring in the Ark of the Covenant. He would bring about a revival and a love for the law and for the Lord. He was a tremendous leader, a gifted king. But about the age of 40, the wheels fell off of his story too. One night, overcome with desire, he did something that Samson never even did. He committed adultery with a married woman, married to one of his best commanders. And to hide it and to cover it up, he arranged murder of that man and was content to try to never deal with it, to walk away from it. And here in these two stories of Samson and David, you have two great men, two great callings, and two great failures. And yet from the moment of their failure, their lives went in completely different directions. Samson died blind, weak, and among his enemies, never accomplishing what God designed him to accomplish. David, on the other hand, would have this very bitter failure and a very bitter experience, but he emerged from it a wiser man and a stronger king. And he would go on to live a great life and be written down in history as a man after God's own heart who died among his friends and left an amazing legacy. Why the difference? I mean, how could both men have such great failures and yet one just kind of stay there and the other totally restore it? How's that possible? How can one guy live a greater life despite his failures? How can one guy leave a greater legacy despite his failures? And it comes back to the value of relationships, to how they chose to live their lives, and mirror to you and I a question of how will you live yours? Not in the short term, not the here and now, but over the long haul, playing for the long game. When you lie on your deathbed, what do you want your life to have been about, to look like? And at the end of his own life, Solomon, who is the son of David, who became another great king for the people of God, wrote this book called Ecclesiastes, and it was kind of a lot of his wisdom of what he had learned and watched. And he wrote something in Ecclesiastes 4, and you can hear the lessons that he learned as a king, that he learned in watching his father, that he learned in watching the failures of Samson. And he wrote this in Ecclesiastes 4. Two are better than one, because they have a good return for their labor. But if either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Also, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. Solomon writes this incredibly practical thing that we all know. And when you look at the life of Samson and David together, it creates these very contrasted distinctions of how to live more like David and not like Samson. The first distinction is this: isolation versus companionship. This is why Solomon wrote the words that 2 are better than 1. No duh, we all know that. Having friends is better than being lonely. Of course it is. We all know that. You don't need me to teach you that. We just need to be reminded of how valuable, how precious the gift of relationships are in our life. And even though we know the value, it's so easy for us to slip into isolating behaviors because of our laziness or because of our selfishness or whatever. I mean, when you watch the life of Samson, if you've never read his story, read it, Judges 13 through 16. And when you read his story, the stories are epic. They're amazing. They're miraculous. But at the center of every one of them is Samson. And unless someone points out to you, you might not even notice that he's always by himself. He never had a supporting cast. He never lived in community. He was always isolated. David was remarkably different with his life. His journey into kingship would begin with befriending Jonathan, who was then the heir to the throne because he's the son of King Saul. They became such good friends. The Bible writes that they had like a hobbit kind of friendship, like Sam and Frodo kind of love for one another, that saved David's life more than one time. In fact, one time Saul, in his jealousy and paranoia, because David was so popular and he's killed giants and he's amazing, everybody loves David, and he got so jealous that he sent his own son to try to kill him. This is what happened. It's written in 1 Samuel 19. It says, Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. But Jonathan had taken a great liking to David and warned him, my father is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning. Go into hiding and stay there. They'd become such great friends, it literally saved David's life. And that began a new pattern in David's life where he always surrounded himself with other people, other friends, community. The Bible would tell us that David, one of the times it writes that every man who was desperate, in debt, or discontent rallied around him and he became their leader. People loved him and they wanted to follow him. David had people around him all of the time. When he became the king, he had around him a great group of leadership of men who had better military exploits than he had had. And he learned to listen to them and work with them and together accomplish something that no one had to that point in the history of God's people. And it asks you and I the question, where are you isolated? Where are you not cultivating the depth or the quality or the quantity of relationships that you need? I mean, think about this. We all need a quantity of relationships, okay? 0 friends is not an option. You're not built for that. It's not good for you to be alone. You might be like a 1 friend kind of person. You might be like a 50 friend kind of person. But you need more than 0. Quantity. If you live in isolation, it's like a farmer who plants no seeds but expects the harvest to be there when they need it. Defies logic. It makes no sense. But I bet if you're like me, your problem's not isolation, it's like oversaturation. You're acquainted with everyone, but no one really knows you. You have tons of friends on Facebook and followers on Twitter, but no one that you can call and hang out with. I remember this happened to me a couple of years ago. We were actually driving to the hospital to have our 3rd son. And so my wife is in the place women are in that moment of her life. And as we're driving, I'm in a different place. And I'm like, this is amazing. And it dawns on me that at this point in my life, I knew tons of people, but I didn't know anyone. I had no relationship deep enough that who would I call to say, hey, celebrate with me. I'm about to go have my son. And it just kind of like dawned on me that I have tons of acquaintances but no depth. And I said that to my wife, and she's like, shut up, I don't want to talk about that. And then we did later. But it was a weird moment where I realized, like, I have tons of friends. And if isolation is like a farmer who didn't plant any seeds, then oversaturation is like farming but not turning the soil over. It's like trying to plant seeds in hard and packed ground that cannot dig deep in its roots, that can't weather the storms of life, that's shallow. So we need a quantity and we need quality relationships, depth, godly people around us to help us in this journey of life. The Apostle Paul would write about the quality of our friends one time in 1 Corinthians 15. He said this, do not be deceived, bad company ruins good morals. Don't deceive yourself. The quality of the people you hang out with determines a lot more about the direction of your life than you might want to credit. I have 3 boys in elementary school, and we talk to them all the time about choosing friends that make good choices. And like if you pick friends who make dumb choices, you're going to end up making dumb choices too. And it's not just true for them. It's still true for us. The quality of the people we hang around matters and has an impact in the direction that our life heads. C.S. Lewis once was quoted writing this. He said, the next best thing to being wise oneself is to live in a circle of those who are. Hey, if you're not that smart, who cares? Just hang out with smart people. Hey, if you don't know how to be a great man and a great husband and a great dad, that's okay. Hang out with men who do. Hey, you don't know that much about the Bible and it intimidates you, or you don't know how to pray, that's okay. Hang out with people who do. Quality, community. You are not meant to live alone. You can't. And it doesn't just affect today. And it doesn't just affect in a month from now when a little crisis strikes. It affects your legacy. It affects the end game of your life. The second distinction that we get from Samson and David is the difference between the Lone Ranger versus the home builder. This is why Solomon wrote those words in Ecclesiastes. He said, pity the one who falls down and has no one to pick him up. We all pity that person. None of us want to be the person out on some journey by ourselves who fall down and have no one around us to care about us, to pick us up. Nobody wants that. And yet, how many times in our life have we been so busy working, so busy accomplishing, for some of us even so busy being a mom or a dad or a husband or a wife, that we neglect all other relationships, all of the friendships, and then when we need them the most, they're not there. Samson's a guy who's written down, when you read his story, who's perpetually on the move, never wasting time, always working on stuff, always chasing things, always moving forward, always alone. In fact, in his story, other than his parents, there's only one other name of a person given who gets close to him, he's a friend with, and it's the devil woman Delilah. That's the only other person in his story that's close to him. David was completely different. David, every time he traveled, he took people with him. And when David established Israel as a nation, he built his home right there in Jerusalem, a home that he could raise his family in, a home that he could invite his friends over to. That became his city. Those were his people. That was his neighborhood. And he built his life, his community right there where he lived. When Samson's world collapsed, when he sinned, he fell among enemies. And there was no one who cared that could hear his cry for help. When David's world fell apart and he sinned, he was right at home, right among his friends where you're supposed to be. And even though he didn't want to hear it at first, he eventually did and was restored and reconciled as a leader. Who do you go to for wise counsel? Who do you give access to your life? Not only do you and I need a quantity of relationships or quality in the relationships, we need proximity. Right? We need someone that we can call that can come over on a moment's notice because you're a Michigan fan and it hurt last night, right? Or because your basement's flooded, or because you're moving and you want someone else to carry boxes with you, or whatever. I've seen it happen so many times in small group that people start going and they're like, I don't know, and and then they build friendships, and then they go see movies together, and then they're learning about the Bible. But when you see small group come alive, when you see community come alive in people's life, is when someone in the group or maybe themselves hits a hard moment, a season in their life. They lose a job, somebody gets sick, somebody passes away, someone's marriage is on the rocks. And in that crisis, community is so beautiful. Friendships and relationships are so beautiful. You and I are called to cultivate depth with those around us. We're built to be in community right here, which is why just coming to church is one step to take, but you've got to get into community. You've got to experience it. You got to be a part of it. You got to see how it will support others and how it will aid you in your journey, not just for today and not just for next month, but for the end of your life when you're around people. I mean, it's actually one of the beautiful parts of church is that there's this positive peer pressure. We're encouraging and challenging each other on to be the people that God calls us to be. Better husbands and better wives, better moms and better dads, better employees and employers, that you and I would be better neighbors because we are in community together. We can't be lone rangers. We need to build our homes. Here's the third distinction from Samson and David. It's a distinction between being reactive and reflective. I mean, when you're a relational person and you lead with other people, you're forced to be reflective, humble. You're forced to be relationally intelligent, to make decisions, to say things that are relationally sensitive. Think of Steve Jobs, a guy that we keep writing books about and watching movies about, who the things he invented and created changed culture. But he's also known for being a total jerk to everyone that worked with him. And when Jesus calls you and I to be friends like he's been a friend to us, it's that you and I would be the exact opposite of that, who are reflective, humble, aware of our failures, and open to be vulnerable to other people. Samson was so not that. Samson was emotionally constipated from what we can tell. He's the strong, silent type. He just did things. He didn't think. He didn't agonize over analyzing his mistakes and trying to learn from them. Evident by the fact that he had no one close enough to him to criticize his relationship with Delilah. How many of you know how important it is to have a friend who's close enough, who loves you enough to tell you when you're being an idiot? We need those friends. Those friends that are willing to smack us upside the head in love, right? You didn't just need to get spanked when you were a kid. We still need it now as adults. We need friends that we give access. And if you don't have a friend close enough to you, you need to go cultivate that kind of relationship. If you leave the service and you don't have a friend to text and just say, hey, today I couldn't stop thinking about how how grateful I am for a friend like you. If you don't have that, how will you go cultivate that? Build that kind of relationship. Samson was never vulnerable. We get no indication of him confessing, being open to God or other people or even himself. I mean, he's supposed to be the spiritual leader of the people of God, and we only have one recorded prayer of his life, and that's the one that we already read in his suicide. And even in that prayer, he's not doing a very good job of identifying his failures. He wants revenge for his eyes. Not even talking about how he landed in that spot in the first place. David, so different. The longest book of the Bible is comprised of story after story, poem after poem, worship song after worship song of David just being open, vulnerable, reflective, humbled, changed, challenged, overwhelmed with the love of God and the call of God in his life. When you lay these two guys' lives next to each other, they are both phenomenally gifted, both called to an amazing mission, born for a very specific reason, designed to accomplish something. And yet the difference in their lives had nothing to do with their level of giftedness. Had everything to do with the style of which they lived, the choices they made, the intentionality they put in relationships. Samson was so headstrong that he was voluntarily blind long before he lost his eyes. He walked right into ambush after ambush, sinful encounter after sinful encounter, giving no one access to his life, no one the ability to hold him accountable, no one to push him. And he died among his enemies, blind and weak, far from home. David did the exact opposite with his life. And everything that David accomplished, being written in history as a man after God's own heart, writing so many worship songs and building for Israel this amazing foundation that they laid, Samson destroyed a pagan temple. David created the ability for then Solomon to build the beautiful temple for their creator, for the God of Israel. David was able to restore, fix, die in old age, and leave a great legacy, raise a great son. But the difference between him and Samson had nothing to do with what he did. It was a direct result of his relationships, his relationship with God and his relationship with godly people.